Chapter 12. In September of 1941, the big news in the Bear Lake stake was that President Herbert J. Grant was coming to Paris to attend and speak at the farewell testimony of Grant C. Snow. Elder Snow had recently been called by the First Presidency to be president of the Northwestern States Mission and was to leave in early October to take up residence at the mission headquarters in Portland, Oregon. The call of Grant Snow to a mission presidency came as a distinct surprise to the saints in Bear Lake Valley. Those who knew Snow and were associated with him held him in rather low esteem. Snow, however, was not just a run-of-the-mill saint. He was the grandson of Herbert J. Grant, president of the church. The paper qualifications and the actual qualifications of Snow for a mission presidency or any executive position were vastly different. Grant Snow was 37 years old, married to a good-looking, accomplished woman, and the father of 3 children. From 1924 to 1927, he had been a missionary in the British mission. The British, German, and Australian missions were reserved for the elect of the church. The run-of-the-mill missionary was sent to Texas, Montana, and North Dakota. From 1927 to 1931, he had been a student at Utah State Agricultural College in Logan, from which he graduated. From 1931 to 1938, he had been successively a junior executive in the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company, the Hotel Utah, ZCMI, and the Beneficial Life Insurance Company. The last 3 years, he had been local manager of the Consolidated Wagon and Machine Company. In addition to his missionary experience in the early 20s, he had been a high councilman in the Bear Lake stake, and for the past 2.5 years, these were the record qualifications of Elder Snow. A more detailed study of Snow's history revealed that he entered the University of Utah in 1922 after failing in his academic subjects in the fall of 1922 and being kicked out and failing again in the fall of 1923. He was denied admission to university and barred from Utah from future entry. He wouldn't get a job after being barred from the university and lived off funds supplied by his mother and grandfather. In 1924, he was sent on a 2.5-year mission to Great Britain, which he served without incident or distinction. Upon release from the mission, he was admitted as a freshman to Utah State Agricultural College. It was no particular intellectual feat to graduate from USAC at the time. The college was small and in need of students. If a person could read well enough to read the morning newspaper, he could, by carefully selecting classes, graduate from Utah State. The academic standards of Utah State were notoriously low, and almost anyone could graduate with some kind of degree. The college, in trying to become a larger institution, needed students, and anyone would do. Snow graduated in 1931 with a major in sociology and a minor in political science. He barely had a sufficient grade point average to graduate, but after a few exceptions were made as to requirements and a few classes were waived, he made it. It was while he was at Cow College in Logan that he met his wife, Elaine Richards, from Morgan, Utah. Miss Richards was a grandniece of one of the general authorities and a brilliant home economics student. The children of general authorities had been intermarrying for hundreds of years, and this had developed into a near incestuous state of affairs. This policy of marriage produced a few brilliant offspring, but the stalwart blood of the church founders was becoming so diluted that a lot of weak vessels resulted in a few near idiots. However, if any person could claim a general authority as a relative, his future in the church was secure. In the rare case where an outsider broke into the elite circle of general authorities, he shone like a star in the east. After graduation from USAC, Snow went to work as an assistant production manager at the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company, a church-owned corporation. He wasn't very ambitious or very smart, and about the only thing he had going for him was the fact that his grandfather was president of the church, and as such, president of several church-owned corporations. Snow soon quit the sugar company and went to work as an assistant manager at the hotel. Another church-owned corporation. He became dissatisfied there and moved over to ZCMI. His position with ZCMI was short-lived, and his grandfather then got him a position with the Beneficial Life Insurance Company, a fast-growing, profitable church-owned corporation. Snow not only failed in this later venture, but cost the company $25,000 one year because he bypassed the underwriting department on some corporate life insurance policies. Snow was a misfit, and his smart old granddad didn't know what to do with him. The practice of placing relatives of general authorities in good positions in church-owned corporations was not new. The church owned or controlled several dozen profitable corporations and afforded their employment in the church offices. It was expected that each general authority would employ so many sons, sons-in-law, and other relatives in these companies. It made no difference whether the relative was qualified or not. Indeed, if he was qualified, he would likely get a job someplace on his own ability. This system worked something like a patronage system enjoyed by congressmen. If the church official moved up in the church government, his retainers moved up too. In 1939, grandfather Herbert J. Grant decided that it would be necessary to get Snow out of Utah, as he had developed a bad reputation in the Salt Lake financial community. Snow was sent to Paris, Idaho, to manage the Consolidated Wagon and Machine Company, a subsidiary of the Salt Lake Hardware, also a church-owned corporation. The local office was small, and it did not appear that Snow could do much damage in this new position. The first fiscal year of operation, Snow lost the company $4,000. The second year, he lost $5,000, and by 1941 he was losing the company $10,000 a year and had alienated many of the good customers. It was at this point that church financial advisors prevailed upon grandfather Herbert J. Grant to do something about his grandson, thus the call to preside over the Northwestern States Mission. For the past 20 or 30 years, mission presidencies had been a haven for black sheep relatives or general authorities and for certain other brethren who had good church connections but had gotten into financial or some other kind of trouble. Real estate brokers, insurance agents, building contractors, and lawyers were forever getting into trouble. Sometimes it was expedient to banish them from Zion for a few years, so the church sent these men to be mission presidents. This served two purposes. It got them out of the way for a few years until their troubles subsided, perhaps keeping them out of jail. And it also somewhat rehabilitated these people in the eyes of the community and enhanced their record qualifications. Grant Snow was a natural to be selected for the mission presidency. He had two immediate qualifications. Number one being that he was the grandson of the president of the church, and number two, that he was a business failure and needed rehabilitation. Traditionally, church general authorities made certain that their children and close relatives held high position in the church. Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Joseph F. Smith, without hesitation, made apostles out of their sons. Brigham Young ordained even a 10-year-old son an apostle. When Joseph Smith was in the Carthage jail, faced with death, he panicked and ordained his moron son to succeed him as something. Herbert J. Grant did not have any sons who lived to maturity, but he made several of his son-in-laws general authorities in the church. Prior to their elevation to positions of general authority, two of President Grant's son-in-laws were so inactive and indifferent towards the church that neighbors and associates didn't know that they even belonged to the church. These men had no qualifications for church leadership except being sons-in-law of the president of the church. For many years, members of the church had said, half in jest and half seriously, that the church had ceased to be run by revelation and now run by relation. Church leadership by relation had nettled Bishop Jackson for many years, but to his joy he lived to see the day when the church had back-to-back presidents, George Albert Smith and David O. McKay, who did not call any of their relatives to high positions. The town of Paris, Idaho, and Bear Lake Steak Tabernacle were made to sparkle in preparation for President Grant's visit. The farewell testimony was advertised throughout southeastern Idaho, and a turnaway crowd was expected. On Sunday, September 21st, 1941, President Grant arrived in Paris for the testimonial of his grandson. The hour for the meeting was 2 p.m., and as expected, there were several hundred people who were unable to get into the tabernacle. It was rare indeed, a rare occasion, when the president of the church visited the outlying stakes of Zion. President Grant had been in Paris 30 years before when he was an apostle, and the saints felt fortunate that a man so prominent should now visit them. President Heber Jedediah Grant was indeed a remarkable man. His father had been a counselor to Brigham Young and had died when Heber was only a few years old. Heber J. had experienced poverty during his youth and had clawed his way to the top through sheer willpower and determination. He was born with a very little natural ability. The only natural qualities that he possessed were ambition and determination, but he would prove that these qualities were the most important of all. In 1941, President Grant was in his middle 80s and senile. In recent years, he had dwelt a great deal in the past and had only 3 sermons that he delivered in the semi-annual conference. The most famous and most boring of these sermons was the discourse of the Word of Wisdom. Friends and intimates had tried to persuade him to lay off the word of wisdom because that subject alienated some of the brethren, but such advice only resulted in his hammering at the word of wisdom with more vigor and denunciation. His second sermon was on how, as a young apostle, he had gone back to New York City and conned New York bankers into lending money to Utah Industries and thus saved the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company. The third conference topic was a self-improvement and how he was an example of self-made man. In September 1941, in the Bear Lake State Tabernacle Grant rolled all 3 of these subjects into one discourse. He had the saints fidgeting in their seats for an hour and 35 minutes. The president began his talk by telling about being put in stake president of the Tooele stake when he was 24 years of age. And that in his first speech, he was barely able to think enough to speak for 4 minutes. He indicated that he gradually increased the time he could speak until after a year he could speak 45 minutes. In later years, he related he could speak an hour and a half without any difficulty. President Grant paid very little attention to the substance of his talks, but took the greatest pride in their length. He denounced his subordinates by speaking at length in church, and advised bishops and stake presidents to hold hour-long meetings. But so far as he was concerned, personally, the success or failure of his own talks was determined by their length. President Grant, in his Paris speech, mentioned only briefly taking the train back to New York to convince the New York bankers that they should put money into the Utah-Idaho Sugar Company. He devoted a full hour to self-improvement and to the fact that he was a self-made man. As a prelude to these later remarks, he quoted from memory his favorite slogan, "That which you persist in doing becomes easy. Not that the nature of the thing changes, but that the power to do increases." This slogan summed up the philosophy that President Grant took with him throughout life. He told the people that as a boy he was a horrible penman and was a poor baseball player and could not carry a tune. He indicated that through persistence he had become a good penman, which of course was true, and his signatures affixed to documents daily attested to the fact. His other accomplishments, however, were in doubt. He indicated that as a boy he went out and threw baseballs at targets in the barn until he could throw swift and straight, and subsequently obtained a position on the team in the Industrial League that won the championship for the state of Utah. All the people who played on these industrial teams at the time Herbert J. Grant talked about were dead, so no one around to contradict what he had said about his baseball prowesses. His self-eulogy on baseball was a good illustration of the familiar adage that the older a man gets, the faster he could run as a boy. After telling the saints how difficult it was for him to learn how to sing, President Grant, on an impulse of which he had had many of late, decided to demonstrate his acquired singing ability. He summoned the organist and directed that she play "We Thank Thee, O God, for a Prophet," and accompanying him while he sang the first two verses. He proceeded to demonstrate for the benefit of his people in his singing ability. The most horrible noises ever to issue forth from a human mouth were emitted from President Grant. Some of the younger people in the audience thought that it was a joke and began to titter a bit. And they thought that perhaps President Grant would make some object lesson out of his demonstration. The older people in the audience knew that he was dead serious and really thought that he had learned how to sing. Some of his contemporaries had thoughtlessly encouraged him and told him that his singing ability had improved, and some of them, in fact, said that he had acquired a good singing voice. He continually embarrassed the church and his brethren by putting on singing demonstrations for different groups. After this had gone on some time, it was rather difficult for one of the brethren to say, "President Grant, you ought to keep your damned mouth shut because you are a horrible singer and you continually embarrass us." There were men in the church, like Joseph Fielding Smith and Melvin J. Ballard, who were in fact good singers and could recognize singing ability, but for some reason they were spineless and lacked the courage to tell President Grant the truth and permitted the travesty to continue year after year. This whole thing about Grant singing got out of hand and was somewhat like the fable of the king's new clothes. Notwithstanding the deterioration of President Grant's mind in later years, he was a great man, and all the church, as well as many others, knew of his great ability and his service to the church. His incompetence in later years brought into focus a problem with general authorities. There was no machinery in the church to retire a general authority when he became incapacitated, either through illness or age, and in every generation there had been one or more of the general authorities who embarrassed the church and his brethren through antics incident to old age. Some even found it impossible to keep their hands off women. The general authorities, without hesitation, would remove a stake president or bishop when he became incapacitated for one reason or other, but as yet nothing had been devised to remove a general authority. Elder Snow departed for his mission presidency at the appointed time and served in his capacity until after the death of his grandfather in the spring of 1945. For the rest of his life, the church would feel some responsibility for Grant Snow and see that he was employed by a church-owned business or some position in the church welfare program.